Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and I came here to talk to you all today about issues of mass incarceration and the way the police interact with communities in the United States. I'm making this video because over the past few years, as movements like the Black Lives Matter movement have blown up and gained more traction due to horrific events and actions caused by the police brutality, I've seen a lot of people in my family, in my wider community, talk about mass incarceration and police brutality like it's an issue on the individual level. I've seen some people talk about how the issue with police is that there are just some that are individually bad, and the system of policing is okay, but there are just some individuals we have to root out. I've also seen those same people talk about how there are so many people incarcerated in the United States today because there are individuals who are a threat to our community and a threat to public safety. And there is so many of them, and that they pose such a great threat that we must lock them all up or they will wreak havoc on our neighborhoods and communities. And the reason I'm making this video today is to use theories of economic geography along with a case study of the city of Poughkeepsie, New York, a deindustrialized town on the Hudson River in the state of New York, to prove that this is not the case. Issues of police action and also, on a broader level, mass incarceration are not due to individual actions, but instead due to a system that systematically hurts the Black community. Now, before I can apply theories of economic geography to the city of Poughkeepsie, New York to prove my point, I first want to make sure everyone is familiar not only with the context of the history of Poughkeepsie, but also the cornerstone economic geography theories I will be using to center today's discussion. So first off, let's just talk about Poughkeepsie. Poughkeepsie is a city in the Hudson Valley, and it has had a long history of a Black community. Slavery was practiced in the city starting around 1663, and W.E. Du Bois even traces his family history back to slaves in this region. While slavery was abolished in New York in 1827, many Black Americans stayed in Poughkeepsie and worked and built their lives and families there. And there was actually the largest wave of migration of Black people to Poughkeepsie occurred in the post-World War II period, when Poughkeepsie's Black population quadrupled to 20% of the city's total population. And although there was no segregation by law like there were with Jim Crow laws in the South, there was evidence of de facto segregation. Essentially what this means is that the segregation was not written into law, but there were more subtle forms of discrimination that still had serious consequences. And by the time we get to around the 1980s and the 1990s, what we see in Poughkeepsie is that most racial and ethnic minority groups and lower income families stayed in the city, while the middle class white Americans moved to the surrounding town of Poughkeepsie. And what's important to note is that the city and town of Poughkeepsie are significantly different. They have separate government, industry, and there were striking socioeconomic differences and also racial. We understand the long history of a Black community in Poughkeepsie, which began with coerced exploitative labor and has ended in segregation and white flight. Let's talk about two theories of economic geography that are important to know before beginning our conversation. First, we have to understand the idea of the spatial fix. This idea came from a 1975 article by geographer David Harvey. In it, he claims that capitalism constantly needs to create fresh room for new capital accumulation. He calls this the crisis of accumulation. Essentially, capital expands too fast for one space to hold all of it. And this means that capital must constantly expand to new spaces and restructure the already built environment to make room for more accumulation. This is called the spatial fix, which is when capital leaves a space of overaccumulation and moves into an underdeveloped space. One thing that's important to keep in mind about this theory is that it necessitates certain regions to be more underdeveloped than others, so disinvested and deindustrialized, because that space needs to lay in wait for the crisis of accumulation, and it can serve as the spatial fix to be built up again. And that's something we see And now we need to talk about racial capitalism, a theory by Cedric Robinson. Essentially, Robinson goes against Marx's idea that theories of capitalism are solely based on class differences. He argues that ethnic and racial differences predate the development of modern economy, and in this way, racial differences served as a cornerstone in making varied landscapes that both culture and capital is able to exploit to create power and profit. Basically, what he's saying is that the system of capitalism necessitates an exploited class for the capitalists to use. And because European society already had this aspect of racialism with built-in hierarchical differences between different types of people, racism served as a way to ensure that there would always be an exploited class. In this case, black people are the exploited class and white people are the exploiters, so that capitalism could function as it needs to. I first want to talk about how police don't just exist to keep communities safe from specific dangerous individuals that they then lock away. They're also a form of state power that can be used to clear people out of certain areas as a way to make room for new capital accumulation. And of course, when they clear people out of these areas, where they go are the prisons. So, in order to understand this, we first need to look at a few theories of economic geography. So, going back to David Harvey's ideas about the spatial fix and capital accumulation, we need to talk about Marx's idea of primitive accumulation. Essentially, Marx describes a prehistory of capitalism as this process of primitive accumulation where the use of force, specifically state power, was used to pave the way for capitalism through the creation of a labor market and private property that was achieved through this violent process of using the state to dispossess people of their land and also their way of life to make room for new areas of capital accumulation and create workers. Now, Marx conceived of this process of capital accumulation as something that occurred generally between the capitalists and the workers in a white European society. However, scholar Rosa Luxemburg disagreed with him and believed that he was oversimplifying the issue, and that as capital kept expanding, and if you remember, as Harvey said, capital constantly needs to expand because that's how it can grow, it will eventually expand out of these white territories, and then it will eventually need other races to exploit, and this is a direct quote from her, territories where the white race is not capable of working. Essentially, this process of primitive accumulation didn't just occur in Europe as capitalism was being implemented, but continuously occurs across the globe as capital moves into underdeveloped areas and takes over from often communities of color that lived in those areas. And while Luxemburg was looking at this on a global scale, Jackie Wang, an economic geographer, argues in her book Carceral Capitalism that we can see this dynamic within the U.S. because of uneven regional economic health and development, often in communities of color. Essentially, that there are these communities of color that are deindustrialized and disinvested in. And when there's a crisis of accumulation in an industrialized, often maybe wider community, near it, there is a process of primitive accumulation that occurs in order to reindustrialize this area to make room for the spatial fix or to solve the problem of this overaccumulation. And if you recall, as I mentioned earlier, the way that this is achieved is through state power. And oftentimes in the United States, in these communities, the police serve as this system of state power that is used to pave the way for new accumulation. So, how do the police operate as an arm of state power in Poughkeepsie? I have a few things that I'm going to be talking about. First of all, I have some statistics that I will show here from the Poughkeepsie Community Action Committee, which is a group of citizens in Poughkeepsie who are not tied to any government organization, but are just dedicated to researching the city of Poughkeepsie police and holding them accountable. And in their research, they found that 87% of non-white residents and 64% of all residents don't feel the city police keep them safe. And 91% of non-white participants and 73% of all participants don't trust city police. Now, these statistics prove that the police's main job and role is not just to keep communities safe from dangerous actors. If it were, we wouldn't see that the majority of people in the city don't actually feel safer with the police around of this. First, I'm going to show a video from a Poughkeepsie Police Department promotional video. Here are some clips. Now, as you can see from these clips, what they're highlighting is not people they save or crimes they stop. What they're highlighting is military-grade gear, operations with incredibly large guns, SWAT operations, tanks. They are not being portrayed as benevolent actors, but actually as something akin to our military, which would go into a community and fight on behalf of the United States government, as opposed to fighting on behalf of keeping whatever community it's going into safe. So I think this is a really good example of just the way that the Poughkeepsie police operate and how they see themselves more as a military operation as opposed to a community building one. Okay, so now that we've talked about how police aren't just used as a tool to keep communities safe, we're going to talk about ways that prisons are used in an economic sense and not just used to keep communities safe. So, to understand this, we have to understand the idea of the prison fix, which is a theory created by economic geographer Ruth Gilmore, and it builds off of Harvey's idea of the spatial fashion. So basically, Ruth Gilmore says that prisons are a way that the government has created a spatial fix. And this whole idea for her started because she was studying prisons in California, and prison building and jail building in California exploded in the 1970s. And she asked herself, why did California build prisons when it could have been using that money to build things like schools or parks or recreation centers or other things that add to community life? And then she realizes that prisons concentrate surpluses. So when you have an overaccumulation of capital, an overaccumulation of labor, an overaccumulation of people, you can solve all of that by building a prison. So, how did she view this in her case study of California? First, she saw that prisons were placed in places where people needed jobs. She'd find that this was true and that small towns who were looking to reinvigorate their flagging economies actually vied for these prisons to be built around them. And then also this idea of surplus labor. So essentially, by building prisons in these economically depressed areas, it solves two issues. First, it solved this issue of surplus land. You have all this land that's not being used. If you build a prison on it, now it is being used and something economically productive is happening on it. And then also this issue of surplus labor. So you have all of these people who are out of work. They can't find a job where they live. So now there's this prison, and as long as there's prisoners, the prison will be open, and there will always be there would always be jobs. So basically, the government needed something to invest in. They decided to invest in prisons because prisons fixed this issue of surplus land and surplus labor. And then, of course, prisons are also a place to put surplus population. So, of course, one way to fix an issue of a lot of people are unemployed is to provide them a job at the prison. But then you also need prisoners. You need a steady stream of prisoners, or all of these new prisons you built will close. And what Gilmore noticed was, right, in California, they had to up the amount of prisoners because they were upping the amount of prisons, so more people needed to be put away. And of course, another great thing about prisons is they also fix this idea of surplus population and surplus labor through prisoners. Once you put someone in the prison system, it doesn't matter that they've not been employed because they're in the prison system and they can't be employed. And so in order to fix this surplus population issue and also make sure that enough prisoners were going to the prisons, California started criminalizing many more things. And in fact, in the year 2000, more people were put away for drug-related crimes than anything else in California. And what else is really interesting is that 44% had not been employed by a single employer for 6 months prior to arrests. So, what these statistics show is not only are people going to jail for things that wouldn't have been criminalized before these prisons were built, thus creating this new steady stream of prisoners, but also the prisoners that are going away are also surplus laborers that the government needed somewhere to put anyways. Okay, so now that we understand Gilmore's idea of the prison fix, this idea that the prisons are a place to concentrate surpluses, let's talk about how this relates to the city of Poughkeepsie. Okay, to do this, I will start by talking about the Dutchess County Jail that is situated in Poughkeepsie. So, the Dutchess County Jail has long been one of the worst offending jails in the state of New York. In 2021, the Dutchess County Jail had 2 inmate suicides in 3 years, and unaddressed fire hazards and lack of education services for the minors that they held there. In fact, the Dutchess County executive, Mark Molinaro, called it an atrocious abomination that threatens the welfare of the people in our care, the safety of corrections officers, and diminishes any effort to engage in good community policing and restorative justice. And recently, the Poughkeepsie government has announced that because of all of these reasons, the jail will be shut down. And community members were incredibly excited. And they really hoped that shutting down this jail would be a way for Poughkeepsie to shift its focus from punishing prisoners to rehabilitation. And instead of building a new jail, build rehabilitation centers where drug offenders and people with mental illness issues could go and get treatment before being able to re-enter society. However, the county announced that instead of doing that, which the community had advocated for, they were going to build a new, bigger jail. That will be completed in 2023. Now, this jail will be called the Justice and Transition Center, and they claim it will put an emphasis on rehabilitation. However, it is still primarily a jail, and it will be a bigger jail that will be able to hold more inmates. And there's a growing... So, as we can see, this bigger jail, on a smaller scale, is this example of new prisons being built in California. So, why would Poughkeepsie want to build a bigger jail? Is it because crime rates are going up? No. No, it's not. Crime rates are actually going down. Violent and property crime rates are going down, as you can see from this chart from the Poughkeepsie Community Action Committee here. However, Poughkeepsie does have an issue of a surplus population. So, what you need to understand is that the majority of the Black community in Poughkeepsie lives in the downtown area of Poughkeepsie, the inner city Main Street area. Now, this area, because of racist practices that will be discussed later, has been historically underinvested in. There's really no business, there's no real industry, and the majority of people are unemployed. However, recently, new investment has poured into this area with luxury condos being built, new restaurants popping up, and the city prioritizing building tourist attractions that will bring outsiders to the downtown Main Street area. And when this began, there were fears that public space would be privatized and that there would be this issue of gentrification where people in the downtown area could no longer afford to live in Poughkeepsie. And what we've actually seen is an example of this. In this screenshot, we can see that Black people in Poughkeepsie, specifically recently, have been more likely to be arrested for nonviolent crimes, and these offenses have increased in the years of 2017 to 2019, which also happens to be the years that this gentrification has started. So, what we can see is the traditional Black neighborhoods in Poughkeepsie are now being this space for new investment, and the government needs a way to clear out the residents so that they can use that space for commercial or luxury housing purposes. At the same time, in tandem, we've seen this rise of arrests for nonviolent crimes and minor offenses in the area, and we've seen this creation of this larger jail that can hold more people. It looks like Ruth Gilmore's prison fix. So what we have is, similarly to what she tracked in California, we have this new jail built, and this jail serves a few purposes. First, it houses this surplus population that the Poughkeepsie police are arresting, rounding up, and sending to the jail. And in the Poughkeepsie Community Action video, they talk about how oftentimes the people arrested in Poughkeepsie are Black men who are the breadwinners, usually for their family. And oftentimes, once they're arrested and sent to jails, where they're usually held for over a year without trial, as they're held there without trial, they usually lose their jobs and lose their homes, and their families are actually forced to move. So we do see that by concentrating this surplus population, the families are usually moved out of the neighborhood because they can no longer afford to pay their rent or their mortgage, and you're leaving this area open for accumulation. So we have this movement of the surplus population to make room for revitalization, and then we also have this concentration of surplus of labor. So there are issues with high unemployment in Poughkeepsie, and this new larger jail will be able to make room for more jobs. And this is important because specifically in the white town of Poughkeepsie, a lot of jobs have left because the main employer was IBM, who has decided to move their headquarters elsewhere. So basically, what we see is we build this larger jail. It concentrates a surplus population of Black people who live in this area that the city wants to revitalize. So they're gone. Investment can pour in and revitalize the city. And we have this labor surplus created by the exodus of IBM from the town of Poughkeepsie, and they can come in and be correctional officers at the new, larger jail. We've seen the state power in action and how it contributes to the prison fix, with police rounding up community members for small offenses and sending them off to prison to concentrate a surplus population and make room for revitalization. And this is the issue of municipal debt. Before I talk about municipal debt in Poughkeepsie, I'm just going to lay a broad picture of municipal debt in America in general, and also how it relates to the prison system. So we're going to go back to our old friend Jackie Wang and her book Carceral Capitalism to get her take on municipal debt. So many cities no longer have money for integral infrastructural improvements. This can be due to the lack of a tax base and or decreased help from the federal government. And this, Jackie Wang believes, has led to systems of revenue extraction that target vulnerable populations, specifically Black Americans. And her main claim is the relationship between the municipal government and the public has become parasitic. And this is because of a few reasons. First, racist housing policies and segregation. Essentially, rock-bottom tax assessments and also regressive tax structures contribute to this problem because oftentimes houses are undervalued in Black neighborhoods, and so in traditionally Black neighborhoods, the city can't get any property tax from them, and in order to make money off of them, they have to extract it in another way, and which leads them to revenue extraction. We've also seen that as oftentimes wealth flees to the suburbs, and oftentimes, as seen in Poughkeepsie, the people left in the inner city are often poor people of color. It's harder to extract tax money from the inner cities, whether because of what I talked about with racist housing policies and these rock bottom tax assessments, or because of just a lack of businesses to tax as well. It has become more important for cities to get their revenue from suburbs, but unfortunately, the way that municipalities have developed, even from the mid 19th centuries, it's really difficult to incorporate suburbs into tax bases. So oftentimes, it's impossible for cities to get any tax money from the suburbs that feed into them. Okay, so what this means is, as Jackie Wang says, the de facto segregation that we talked about above that occurs in Poughkeepsie, and this is a direct quote from Wang, exposes Black Americans to hyper-policing, municipal fine farming, and harsh austerity measures. Essentially, because municipalities don't get support from the federal government, and oftentimes in cities that are traditionally Black, or neighborhoods are traditionally Black, they can't really get any tax money. They have to resort to revenue extraction as a way to make money to run the city. This often comes in the form of municipal fines, so fining people for small things. This leads to hyper-policing because in order to make money off of municipal fines, you have to have police out to look for these fines. And then also what happens is that people are arrested when they can't pay these fines. So you have the police not acting as protectors of community safety, but the police acting on behalf of the government as revenue generators, fining people and arresting them when they cannot pay these fines, and putting a bunch of people away who actually did nothing illegal except that they were too poor to pay the things that they were fined for by their city. And we absolutely see this in Poughkeepsie. Okay, so now let's talk about how we see Wang's ideas of de facto segregation, hyper-policing, and municipal fine farming in Poughkeepsie. First off, let's talk about de facto segregation. So, as I mentioned before, the town of Poughkeepsie is majority white communities, and the city of Poughkeepsie is majority communities of color. And this did not happen on accident. Throughout the mid to late 20th century, real estate agents in Poughkeepsie would actually only show white newcomers houses in the town of Poughkeepsie as opposed to the city of Poughkeepsie as a way to keep it segregated. On top of this, white people intentionally living in their own communities, insular from the communities of color, the town of Poughkeepsie actually moved to distance itself from the economic and governmental workings of the city in the 20th century. One example of this is that the town and the city used to be part of the same school district, but in the mid-20th century, citing fears of urban schools, the town of Poughkeepsie successfully was able to make its own school district separate from the city school district. This meant that the schools became more segregated because you had all of the children of color going to one set of schools and all of the white children going to another. But it also meant that all of the tax money that would have gone to the schools from the town was now concentrated in town schools. And the city schools lost off of all of that revenue. And as a matter of fact, as we can see, there was not only segregation, but a real movement to separate itself from the city and leave the city to fend for itself. So this is this first thing. We see this de facto segregation. Now, how does the de facto segregation relate to revenue? So traditionally, unless a municipality is getting money from its state or federal government, it's getting money from taxes, municipal taxes. Now, in Poughkeepsie, there is no real tax base. The first reason is that while the town had for-profit businesses like IBM and retail, the city only had welfare services, cultural venues, federal, state, and county government offices. All of these industries are tax exempt, which means they don't have to pay taxes to the city or for the land they operate on, which means that the city gets no real tax base from businesses. And now what about the taxes they get from the residents? As Wang mentioned, neighborhoods of color, specifically black neighborhoods, are systematically undervalued in this country. Basically, what that means is that they are valued for less and therefore pay less in property taxes, which means that because the city is majority black neighborhoods, there is no real property tax base either. This, combined with the issues of all of the industries being tax exempt, means that the city has no strong tax base to draw from and thus must use fines as a way to generate revenue. And now I'll talk about taxing of their communities through these municipal fines. And if whoever they fine can pay, it turns into revenue for the city. And if they're too poor to pay, they're arrested and sent to the Dutchess County Jail. So, what we see in terms of municipal debt is, again, the police are used as this arm of state power, not to keep communities safe, but to help the state generate revenue. And as a byproduct of revenue generation for the municipal government, people are sent to prison not because they're dangerous, not because they're hurting their community, but because they weren't able to generate revenue for the city and they are now being punished. So, what I hope you understand from this section is that a huge amount of people in prisons, according to the Poughkeepsie Community Action Collaborative, an upward trending amount of people in the Dutchess County Jail, are not put away because they did something incredibly dangerous, merely because they suffer from being too poor to pay these fines. Alright, thank you for sticking with me throughout this video. I am going to head into the conclusion and just sum up everything that we've talked to today. So, what I hope everyone has gleaned from this video is that policing and prisons are not just systems that are meant to keep communities safe from dangerous individuals. They are also used as tools of the government to uphold capitalist systems. And here are the 3 ways I showed this. First, state power. Police are used as a way for the state to exert power against exploited populations and make these populations economically productive.